You really should have checked who audited your books before you mocked me in public. The microphone squealed so loud half the room flinched. Somebody near the coffee station laughed nervously, but nobody was laughing at me anymore. Not after the projector lit up the back wall with 3 years of missing HOA funds and the name Linda Carrington highlighted in red across 6 separate bank transfers. 10 minutes earlier, those same people had been clapping while the HOA board tried to humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood. Funny how quickly a room changes when corruption finally gets dragged into fluorescent light. The air inside the Willow Creek clubhouse smelled like burned coffee, cheap lemon cleaner, and summer rain blowing through the cracked windows. Folding chairs scraped against the tile floor while Linda stood at the front of the room wearing one of those perfectly pressed white blazers that rich suburban women seem to treat like armor. Her diamond bracelet caught the overhead lights every time she pointed at someone. Usually me. Claire Whitmore has once again submitted unnecessary complaints against this board, she announced with that syrupy smile that always sounded rehearsed. At some point, constant paranoia becomes harassment. A few people chuckled. One man coughed into his hand to hide it. I stayed quiet in the back row with my old gray laptop sitting closed on my knees. Linda loved that. She mistook silence for weakness. Most of them did. That's the thing about people like Linda Carrington. They think loud people are dangerous and quiet people are harmless. They never understand that some quiet people are simply listening long enough to collect evidence. Outside, thunder rolled low over the lake behind the clubhouse. The windows rattled softly from the storm moving in across the water. I could still smell wet asphalt from the parking lot through the open side door. Linda flipped another page dramatically. Perhaps if Claire spent less time spying on board members and more time maintaining her property, we wouldn't be discussing this tonight. More laughter. Sharper this time. My fingers rested calmly on the silver USB drive in my coat pocket while she kept talking. I remember staring at the fake stone fireplace behind her and noticing how the HOA had spent $12,000 renovating it according to last year's budget report. Funny thing was, the fireplace had clearly never been touched. Same cracked grout. Same water stain near the baseboard. Numbers leave fingerprints. That was something my husband used to say before cancer took him 2 winters ago. I used to investigate federal contractor fraud for a living back then. Long nights. Financial crimes. People hiding dirty money behind clean paperwork. After Daniel died, I left all of it behind and moved to Willow Creek because I wanted silence. A small house by the lake. Gray mornings. No politics. No fighting. But corruption has a smell to it once you've worked around it long enough. Like electrical wires burning inside a wall. You don't see the fire immediately. You just know something underneath is getting hot. Linda kept smiling while she held up another violation notice against me. Maybe our community would finally know peace if certain residents stopped acting like victims. That was the moment I finally stood up. Chairs creaked. Somebody near the front whispered my name. I walked slowly toward the projector table while rain started tapping harder against the clubhouse windows. Linda's smile faded for the first time all night when I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. Then I looked directly at the board and said the one thing that made the entire room go silent. Before you vote tonight, you may want to see where your HOA fees actually went. Nobody spoke for almost 4 full seconds after I plugged in the drive. You could hear the rain hammering the clubhouse roof and the faint electric hum from the old projector mounted above the ceiling tiles. Linda Carrington stood frozen beside the podium with that same polished smile still hanging on her face, except now it looked brittle around the edges. Like glass ready to crack. I clicked the first folder open without saying another word. Monthly landscaping expenses filled the screen. $48,000 charged over 6 months to a company called Green River Exterior Solutions. The problem was Green River Exterior Solutions did not exist. No business license. No contractor registration. No tax filings in the state of Texas. Just a post office box 30 miles outside Austin and direct deposits connected to an account owned by Daniel Reeves, the HOA treasurer, sitting 3 chairs to Linda's left. The man immediately reached for his collar like the room had suddenly gotten hotter. I remember the smell of burnt coffee drifting from the refreshment table near the back wall while residents leaned forward in their seats trying to read the numbers on the screen. People always react the same way when they realize corruption has been quietly sitting beside them for years. First confusion. Then denial. Then anger. Linda recovered fast. I will give her that. This is absurd, she snapped, forcing out a laugh that sounded too sharp to be natural. Claire, you cannot just throw random spreadsheets onto a projector and accuse people of crimes. Crimes. Interesting choice of word. I had not used it yet. I looked at her calmly and clicked the next file. Copies of wire transfers appeared beside enlarged signatures from HOA approvals. Same handwriting. Same authorization patterns. Same routing numbers. $312,000 redirected over 20 months into shell accounts tied to board members and family relatives. Somebody near the front whispered, "Holy hell." Linda's knuckles turned white around the edge of the podium. But none of this started tonight. It started 11 months earlier on a cold October morning when I first moved into Willow Creek. Back then, nobody paid attention to me. That was exactly how I wanted it. My little house sat near the edge of the lake where the roads curved away from the larger homes. Gray siding. Small porch. Wind chimes that clicked softly whenever storms rolled across the water. I drove a 12-year-old Subaru Outback with faded paint on the rear bumper and spent most evenings sitting alone with paperwork spread across my kitchen table while old jazz records played quietly in the background. After Daniel died, silence became easier than conversation. Easier than explaining why hospital. Smells still made my chest tighten. Easier than talking about the nights I stayed awake staring at empty rooms that used to feel alive. Willow Creek was supposed to be my reset button. Quiet neighborhood. Predictable routines. No investigations. No federal audits. No courtrooms filled with men in expensive suits pretending numbers could not expose them. But people like Linda never leave quiet people alone for long. The first HOA violation arrived 3 weeks after I unpacked my last moving box. Unauthorized exterior decor. Apparently my late husband's old metal fishing bell hanging on the porch did not meet community aesthetic standards. $50 fine. I still remember standing barefoot on cold kitchen tile holding that violation notice while rain tapped against the windows and coffee went cold beside the sink. Something about the wording bothered me immediately. Too aggressive. Too calculated. It was not about rules. It was about pressure. Control leaves patterns behind just like fraud does. And once you spend enough years investigating financial crimes, you start noticing patterns everywhere. The second violation notice arrived 4 days later, taped directly to my front door with bright orange paper like some kind of public warning label. Lawn maintenance non-compliance. $85. The grass measured 1 inch above HOA guidelines according to Linda Carrington herself. I remember standing on my porch at 6:30 in the morning wearing Daniel's old gray sweatshirt while cold lake wind pushed dead leaves across the driveway. My coffee smelled burnt because I had forgotten the pot on the warmer too long, but I barely noticed. I was staring at the signature line instead. Linda never delegated the early notices. That told me something important right away. Control freaks always want personal involvement during the intimidation phase. It makes them feel powerful. Over the next few weeks, the violations kept coming. My mailbox color was apparently inconsistent with neighborhood standards. My recycling bin sat visible from the street for 14 minutes after pickup. My porch light brightness exceeded acceptable guidelines. Petty things. Small things. But financial predators rarely start with large pressure. They test boundaries first. Like tapping on glass to see where it cracks. Every envelope carried the same artificial friendliness. Every notice included threats about liens, penalties, and possible legal review by the board. Meanwhile, Linda drove through the neighborhood every morning in her white Lexus SUV, moving slower than a funeral procession, sunglasses on, manicured fingers draped across the steering wheel like she owned every house she passed. Willow Creek looked beautiful from the outside. Trimmed hedges. Fresh mulch. American flags hanging from porches. But once you stayed long enough, you started noticing the fear underneath the landscaping. Curtains twitching whenever the HOA golf cart rolled by. Elderly residents apologizing for things that did not need apologies. People lowering their voices whenever Linda's name came up. One afternoon I met Martha Hill while checking my mail. 73 years old. Widow. Tiny woman with silver hair and trembling hands that smelled faintly of lavender lotion. She glanced around before speaking to me like someone afraid of being overheard. "You should be careful around Linda," she whispered. "She likes finding people who live alone." That sentence stayed with me. Especially the way Martha said it. Quiet. Defeated. Like experience had already taught her how these things worked. 2 weeks later, I found out exactly what she meant. The clubhouse hosted one of those mandatory community socials where everyone pretends they enjoy standing around folding tables eating stale cookies while HOA board members congratulate themselves. The room smelled like crock-pot meatballs and scented candles trying too hard to hide mildew. Linda stood near the refreshment table laughing loudly with Daniel Reeves and another board member named Greg Talbot, a heavy-set contractor with expensive cowboy boots and a habit of interrupting people mid-sentence. I stayed near the back wall sipping flat soda and listening. That is when I overheard Greg joking about Martha Hill's property. "Another few violations and she will cave," he muttered quietly while flipping through paperwork. Prime. Lake Access Lot 2. Linda smirked over the rim of her wine glass. "Some people hold on to homes they cannot afford. We are helping the neighborhood evolve." Evolve. That word hit me harder than it should have. I watched Martha sitting alone near the window clutching a paper plate in both hands while thunderclouds gathered over the lake outside. Suddenly the pattern sharpened. Widows. Elderly homeowners. Veterans living on fixed income. Residents without families nearby. Linda was not enforcing community standards. She was applying financial pressure against vulnerable people until they either paid impossible fines or sold property below market value. The violations were not random. They were targeted. Organized. Deliberate. And once I realized that, I stopped seeing Willow Creek as a quiet suburban neighborhood. I started seeing it the way I used to see fraudulent corporations during federal audits. Not as a community. As a machine. Once I recognized the pattern, I stopped reacting emotionally to the violation notices. That was the first mistake Linda made. She thought pressure created panic. In reality, pressure creates data if you know where to look. I started documenting everything. Dates. Times. Fine amounts. Signatures. Even the way notices were delivered. Some arrived certified. Others appeared taped to doors after board meetings. The inconsistency mattered. Fraud always leaks through human behavior first. Every night my kitchen turned back into something I had not seen since my federal audit days. Stacks of papers spread across the table beneath warm yellow light. Laptop open beside cold coffee cups. Rain tapping softly against the windows while old jazz crackled through dusty speakers near the bookshelf. There is a certain silence that comes with financial investigations. Not peaceful silence. Focused silence. The kind where your brain starts connecting invisible lines before your eyes fully catch up. 3 months into living at Willow Creek, I requested a copy of the HOA annual budget report under community transparency guidelines. Linda acted irritated when I asked. Too irritated. Most residents do not concern themselves with accounting details, she told me during one board meeting while filing her nails behind the podium. That sentence alone told me I was getting close to something. Honest organizations never fear questions. The records arrived in a thick envelope 2 days later, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and printer toner. At first glance, everything looked polished. Landscaping costs, maintenance fees, security expenses, legal retainers. But the numbers underneath were wrong in ways only trained eyes notice. Repeated invoice sequencing, rounded reimbursements, duplicate repair charges submitted under slightly different vendor names. Tiny inconsistencies buried beneath thousands of lines designed to overwhelm ordinary residents. I sat at my kitchen table until almost 2 in the morning tracing payment histories while lake wind rattled the porch screens outside. By midnight, I already knew at least 4 vendors listed in the budget were fake. By 1:30, I found direct financial overlap between Greg Talbot's construction company and HOA emergency repair funds. But the real crack appeared because of Martha Hill. One afternoon I found her crying quietly outside the mailbox cluster near the entrance fountain. The air smelled like fresh mulch and gasoline from a landscaping truck idling nearby while she held a foreclosure warning in trembling hands. $26,000 in accumulated HOA penalties. Late fees. Legal fees. Emergency maintenance charges. Charges she swore she never approved. They said my roof violated storm standards, she whispered. But nobody ever fixed anything. That sentence hit like ice water. I drove her home myself and checked the supposed maintenance records later that night. According to HOA invoices, Martha's roof repair had cost $18,000 6 months earlier. According to reality, her roof still leaked into the guest bedroom every time it rained. I sat in my dark kitchen staring at those numbers while thunder rolled low across the lake outside. The smell of wet cedar drifted through the cracked window above the sink. And suddenly the entire operation became clear. They were manufacturing violations against vulnerable homeowners, then funneling fake repair payments through shell contractors connected to board members. Some residents paid out of fear. Others lost homes they could not financially defend. Either way, the board profited. That was the moment this stopped being neighborhood politics for me. It became organized financial exploitation disguised as suburban governance. The next morning Linda waved cheerfully at me from her Lexus while driving past my house. Perfect makeup. Perfect smile. Sunglasses reflecting morning sunlight off the lake. She had no idea I spent the previous night uncovering enough fraudulent accounting to trigger state-level investigations. And the scariest part was how comfortable they had become doing it. Predators always grow careless once they believe nobody is watching. The strange thing about corrupt people is how quickly they mistake politeness for surrender. After the violations against Martha Hill escalated, I expected Linda Carrington to become cautious. Instead, she became bolder. The fines against me doubled over the next 6 weeks. $100 for an unauthorized bird feeder. $200 for improper lakefront vegetation. $300 because my porch repainting project had supposedly exceeded approved maintenance timelines even though the paint cans were still sealed in my garage. Every notice arrived faster than the last, like somebody inside the board was getting impatient. Good. Impatient people make mistakes. I kept playing the role they expected. Quiet widow. Lonely homeowner. Easy target. At board meetings I sat near the back with folded hands while Linda smiled at me the way rich people smile at waiters they plan to complain about later. She loved public humiliation. The board all did. One Tuesday evening Greg Talbot joked that I should spend less time playing detective and more time fixing my property values. The room laughed while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and cheap coffee burned in metal warmers near the wall. I laughed softly too. That confused him. What none of them realized was that every meeting gave me more evidence. Every insult. Every rushed decision. Every financial approval pushed through without proper voting procedure. I started recording timestamps the same way I used to during federal contract investigations. Patterns emerged everywhere. Emergency landscaping projects always approved after regular residents left meetings early. Legal expenditures authorized without invoice reviews. Maintenance contracts assigned to vendors whose mailing addresses connected back to board members. The machine was getting sloppy. Then Linda handed me the biggest mistake yet. Early one rainy Thursday morning, I found contractors outside Martha Hill's house replacing sections of fencing she never requested. The smell of wet sawdust drifted through the street while nail guns popped in sharp bursts beneath gray skies. Martha stood on her porch wrapped in a cardigan looking terrified. "They said I have no choice," she whispered when I walked over. "They already approved the emergency repairs." Emergency repairs worth $14,000 according to the invoice later posted in the HOA records. $14,000 for less than 200 feet of cheap fencing installed by Greg Talbot's own construction company. I photographed everything from my car while rain rolled across the windshield in silver streaks. Receipts. License plates. Contractor logos. By that afternoon, I traced the payment authorization directly to an HOA reserve account already running suspiciously low. That was when I realized this operation was collapsing financially. They were accelerating fines because they needed cash flow. Fast. The pressure campaign was no longer just greed. It was desperation. I spent the next several nights rebuilding their entire accounting history from public filings, archived budgets, and bank disclosures buried in resident meeting packets. My kitchen smelled permanently like stale coffee and printer ink while spreadsheets covered every inch of the dining table. Outside, spring storms rolled over the lake almost nightly, rattling windows while thunder echoed across dark water. Around 1 in the morning on a Sunday, I finally found the thread that tied everything together. Shell companies. 5 of them. Different names. Different post office boxes. Same routing numbers feeding back into accounts connected to Linda Carrington and Daniel Reeves. More than $480,000 redirected over 3 years. I leaned back in my chair staring at the screen while cold rain tapped softly against the glass above the sink. The numbers glowed pale blue across the dark kitchen. There it was. The entire board had not just been abusing homeowners. They had been quietly draining the community itself. And suddenly I understood why Linda hated questions so much. Questions were the one thing capable of collapsing the illusion she built her entire little kingdom on. After I uncovered the shell companies, I stopped thinking like a homeowner and started thinking like an investigator again. The shift happened quietly. Same house. Same lake outside my kitchen window. Same rain tapping against the roof at night. But suddenly every document on my table stopped being neighborhood drama and started becoming evidence. I built timelines across entire walls using printed transaction records and colored tabs just like I used to during federal contractor audits years earlier. Red for fraudulent payments. Blue for connected vendors. Yellow for residents targeted before sudden property sales. By the end of the second week, Willow Creek no longer looked like an HOA. It looked like a coordinated extraction scheme hiding behind landscaping rules and smiling board meetings. The smell of printer toner and reheated coffee permanently hung in my kitchen while spreadsheets glowed late into the night. I barely slept. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I finally understood how deep it went. Linda Carrington was not simply stealing money. She was manufacturing financial pressure against selected homeowners until they either surrendered properties or accepted inflated repair costs tied to board-controlled contractors. Every violation notice created revenue. Every emergency assessment created opportunity. Every frightened resident became another source of cash flow. And the worst part was how ordinary it all looked from the outside. Kids still rode bicycles around the lake. Neighbors still waved politely near the mailboxes. American flags still fluttered above trimmed hedges while corruption quietly fed beneath the surface like termites inside a wall. Then I found the transfer that changed everything. $28,000 labeled as Community Storm Recovery Reimbursement. Approved 6 months earlier after a hailstorm that barely damaged 2 fences and a gazebo roof. The payment went directly into a consulting account connected to Linda Carrington personally. Not a vendor. Not a contractor. Her. I remember staring at the routing number while cold wind pushed rain against the kitchen windows hard enough to rattle the glass. She had stopped hiding it carefully. That only happens when people believe nobody capable of understanding the numbers is paying attention anymore. The next morning Linda appeared at my front door unannounced. I opened it to the smell of expensive perfume mixing with damp air from the storm outside. She smiled politely while holding another violation notice against my property. Your dock lighting exceeds approved brightness levels after 10 o'clock, she said sweetly. Several neighbors have complained. Nobody had complained. My dock light barely worked half the time. But I noticed something else immediately. She was nervous. Tiny things gave it away. Her fingers tapping too fast against the clipboard. The stiffness around her smile. The way her eyes kept scanning past me into the house like she was trying to see something. Predators sense danger before they fully understand it. You seem very interested in my paperwork lately, Claire, she added casually. There it was. Confirmation. They knew I was asking questions. I smiled softly and handed the violation back to her. I used to work with financial compliance reviews, I said calmly. Bad accounting habits stand out to me. For the first time since moving into Willow Creek, Linda's smile completely disappeared. Just for half a second. But half a second was enough. Then she recovered and laughed too loudly. Well, I am sure our records are perfectly fine. She left quickly after that, heels clicking sharply against the wet porch boards while thunder rolled low across the lake behind her. That afternoon the board announced an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday night. Mandatory attendance encouraged. New financial concerns regarding resident transparency. The wording alone almost made me laugh. They were trying to scare the neighborhood before I could expose them. Trying to control the narrative before facts surfaced publicly. Which meant panic had finally entered the room. Good. Panic makes arrogant people reckless. And reckless people sign documents they should never approve. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock Tuesday night, but by 6:15 the clubhouse parking lot already looked packed. Headlights reflected off wet pavement while thunderclouds rolled low across the lake behind the neighborhood. I sat inside my Subaru for a moment watching residents hurry through the drizzle carrying umbrellas and folded meeting notices. Most of them still had no idea what was really happening. They thought this was another HOA dispute. Another boring argument about landscaping fees or parking violations. The smell of rain and damp asphalt drifted through the cracked window while my laptop bag rested on the passenger seat beside me. Inside that bag sat 3 flash drives, 2 printed audit summaries, and enough financial evidence to collapse the entire board before the night ended. But the evidence itself was only half the plan. Timing mattered more. People do not remember the truth nearly as strongly as they remember the moment the truth shattered someone powerful. That was the real reason I stayed quiet for months. Linda needed to destroy herself publicly. I walked into the clubhouse at exactly 6:58. The room buzzed with nervous energy beneath harsh fluorescent lights while folding chairs scraped across tile floors. Somebody burned another pot of coffee near the refreshment table. I could smell it immediately. Bitter. Overheated. Linda Carrington stood near the podium wearing another white blazer, smiling too hard while Daniel Reeves whispered frantically beside her, flipping through paperwork with shaking hands. Greg Talbot avoided eye contact entirely. Interesting. Fear was finally spreading through the board itself. Martha Hill spotted me entering and gave a tiny nervous nod from the second row. Around her sat residents I now recognized as patterns in spreadsheets. Elderly homeowners targeted with repair assessments. Widowers buried beneath legal fees. Veterans fined over technical violations. Linda thought she had built authority. What she really built was a long list of witnesses waiting for permission to stop being afraid. The meeting started exactly at 7 o'clock with Linda tapping the microphone twice. Tonight we will address harmful misinformation being spread throughout the community, she announced smoothly. There it was. Control the narrative first. Standard crisis management. Her voice echoed slightly through the clubhouse speakers while rain rattled the windows harder outside. Certain residents have chosen to weaponize paranoia and accusations against hardworking volunteers. A few board supporters clapped politely. Linda glanced directly at me while smiling. Frankly, it is disappointing behavior from someone who claims to value community. I stayed silent. Calm. That unsettled her more than arguing would have. She spent the next 10 minutes trying to paint me as unstable without directly saying the word. Isolated widow. Obsessive behavior. Excessive records requests. Harassment toward board members. Every sentence carefully designed to poison the room before I spoke. But she kept making one critical mistake. She talked too much. The longer people lie publicly, the harder they fall when facts appear. Then came the moment she truly doomed herself. Linda held up a printed violation notice against my property and laughed softly into the microphone. Perhaps if Claire spent less time spying on financial records and more time maintaining her home, we would not be wasting everyone's evening. The room chuckled uneasily. I heard one man cough into his hand. Somewhere near the back, ice clinked inside a styrofoam cup. Linda smiled wider, thinking she had regained control. That was when I noticed Daniel Reeves staring at the exit doors instead of the crowd. Sweat darkened the collar of his dress shirt despite the cold air conditioning blasting through the clubhouse vents. He knew something was coming. Good. I slowly stood from my chair while thunder cracked across the lake loud enough to shake the windows. The room quieted almost immediately. I carried my laptop toward the projector table without rushing. No anger. No dramatic speech. Just the soft sound of my heels crossing tile floors while 50 people watched in silence. Linda folded her arms tightly as I plugged the silver flash drive into the laptop beside the podium. Then I looked directly at the board and said the sentence I had waited months to say. You should have audited your own books before trying to intimidate someone who used to investigate financial fraud for a living. The room went completely silent after I said it. Not polite silence. Real silence. The kind where people stop shifting in their chairs because instinct suddenly tells them something serious is unfolding. Rain hammered against the clubhouse windows while the projector fan hummed softly above us. Linda Carrington stared at me with her smile frozen halfway across her face like her brain had not fully caught up yet. Then I opened the first folder. Spreadsheets filled the projection screen in pale blue columns beside enlarged bank transfers highlighted in red. Vendor payments. Reserve withdrawals. Emergency assessments. All connected through the same routing numbers feeding directly into shell companies owned by board members. Gasps moved through the room in waves as residents leaned forward trying to read the amounts. $48,000 for non-existent landscaping. $26,000 charged to elderly homeowners for repairs never completed. Legal fees billed to residents but transferred into private consulting accounts. Every line item carried signatures from Linda, Daniel Reeves, or Greg Talbot. I did not raise my voice once. I simply clicked through evidence while speaking calmly the way I used to during federal audit briefings. This account belongs to Green River Exterior Solutions, I explained while enlarging a transaction history. Green River Exterior Solutions does not legally exist. However, the bank account receiving these funds belongs to Daniel Reeves. Daniel immediately stood up so fast his chair tipped backward onto the tile floor with a loud crack. Sweat glistened across his forehead beneath the fluorescent lights. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Those records are confidential." "Wrong answer." Several residents began murmuring angrily at once. Martha Hill covered her mouth with trembling fingers when I displayed invoices connected to her property. $14,000 billed for fence repairs using a contractor company registered to Greg Talbot's brother-in-law. The fence still leaned sideways outside her home. "You charged elderly residents for fake maintenance," I said quietly. Greg's face turned dark red. Linda finally stepped forward, gripping the podium hard enough for her knuckles to whiten. "She hacked private financial records," she shouted. "This woman has been harassing the board for months." There it was. Panic. Loud. Emotional. Desperate. Exactly what I expected. I clicked another file open. Recorded audio filled the clubhouse speakers. Linda's own voice echoed through the room from a private board discussion recorded during a meeting 3 months earlier. "Push the liens harder," the recording said clearly. "People living alone usually fold fastest." Somebody in the front row whispered, "My God." Another resident stood up asking about his own fines. Then another. And another. The room transformed in less than 60 seconds. Fear changed sides. Linda looked around wildly as angry homeowners began demanding explanations all at once. Daniel Reeves quietly started inching toward the side exit near the refreshment table. He almost made it too. Then the clubhouse doors opened behind him. Cold rain air swept through the room, carrying the sharp smell of wet pavement and thunderstorm wind. 2 county investigators stepped inside beside Officer Ethan Brooks from the Sheriff's Department. Dark jackets. Waterproof folders tucked beneath their arms. Calm faces. The entire room froze again instantly. One investigator walked straight toward the board table without raising his voice. "Mrs. Carrington," he said evenly, "we need to discuss multiple financial irregularities connected to Willow Creek Homeowners Association accounts." Linda blinked rapidly, like she could not process what she was hearing. "This is outrageous," she whispered. "You cannot just walk in here based on lies." The investigator calmly placed a printed document on the podium. "Actually," he replied, "the formal complaint included bank records, contractor filings, witness statements, and audit summaries compiled over the last 4 months. Then he glanced toward me briefly before adding the sentence that finally shattered whatever authority Linda thought she still had left. The documentation was extremely thorough. Nobody in that room looked at Linda Carrington the same way after that moment. 6 months later, the Willow Creek clubhouse looked completely different. The stale smell of burnt coffee was gone. The fluorescent lights had finally been replaced. Fresh paint covered the walls where old board notices used to hang like threats disguised as community updates. Most importantly, people actually talked to each other again. Real conversations. Real laughter. Not the nervous little whispers that used to die whenever Linda Carrington walked into a room. Funny how quickly fear disappears once somebody finally turns the lights on. The investigation spread far beyond what residents originally expected. County auditors uncovered years of fraudulent billing tied to shell companies connected to multiple former board members. State regulators froze several HOA accounts during the financial review. Greg Talbot lost his contractor license after investigators connected his company to falsified repair invoices. Daniel Reeves agreed to cooperate once the bank records started piling up. Numbers have a way of removing loyalty from corrupt people. Especially when prison accountants start asking questions. As for Linda Carrington, the woman who once treated Willow Creek like her own private kingdom quietly vanished from the neighborhood before summer ended. Her house near the golf course sat empty for weeks with newspapers collecting rainwater at the end of the driveway while legal notices piled up in the mailbox. Nobody missed her golf cart slowly patrolling the streets every morning. Nobody missed the violation letters taped to doors. Nobody missed the way conversations used to stop whenever her white Lexus rolled past. The silence she left behind felt peaceful instead of tense. Martha Hill kept her home. That mattered most to me. Community volunteers helped repair her roof properly after the fraud investigations exposed how much money had been stolen from vulnerable residents over the years. I still remember standing in her kitchen one Saturday morning while the smell of fresh pancakes drifted through the house and rain tapped softly against the windows. She smiled at me over a chipped coffee mug and said, "I forgot what this neighborhood felt like before people became afraid." That sentence stayed with me longer than any courtroom victory ever did during my old career. Fear changes people slowly. So slowly, they often do not notice it happening. They stop asking questions. Stop speaking up. Stop trusting their own instincts. Until one day silence becomes normal. I understood that better than most. After Daniel died, silence was all I wanted. I moved to Willow Creek because I thought isolation would feel safer than grief. Smaller life. Smaller world. No investigations. No fraud cases. No more nights staring at spreadsheets under fluorescent office lights while powerful people lied directly to my face. But corruption has a way of recognizing quiet people. It mistakes grief for weakness. Loneliness for vulnerability. Linda Carrington thought she found another isolated widow she could pressure into submission with paperwork and public humiliation. Instead, she accidentally targeted someone who spent 15 years dismantling financial fraud for a living. These days I spend most mornings sitting on my dock with coffee while mist rolls slowly across the lake. The neighborhood feels different now. Lighter somehow. Kids ride bicycles past my house again. People wave without nervousness in their eyes. The new HOA board publishes every expense online where residents can actually read it. Transparency turned out to be remarkably effective once criminals stopped running the meetings. Sometimes at sunset the wind still carries faint echoes from the old clubhouse across the water. Folding chairs scraping tile. Floors. Thunder rattling windows. Linda's voice breaking the moment she realized the room no longer belonged to her. And every now and then, I think back to the night they laughed at the quiet woman sitting alone in the back row. Biggest mistake they ever made. Because power does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks quietly into the room carrying spreadsheets and patience. And sometimes justice looks exactly like a woman everyone underestimated finally deciding she is heard enough.